Right, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to listen to my presentation, and I'd also like to thank Edgard for putting on such an excellent conference. I've really learnt a lot in the couple of days I've been attending these sessions, and I'm ashamed to think how ignorant I was before I came here about India and Brazil. So thank you very much, and I'm going to talk about the correspondence between the Holocaust and contemporary anti-Semitism in the UK, with specific reference to a political judgment and a legal judgment, both of which were made very recently, earlier this year. And if there are any things I refer to during the presentation that you don't understand, please ask me in question time. I don't want to elaborate on too much during the presentation for the sake of keeping time, so do ask me afterwards. Two judgments in England earlier this year influenced my choice of topic for this paper. The first was made by the Liberal Democrat MP for Bradford East, David Ward, after signing the Book of Remembrance on Holocaust Memorial Day in the Houses of Parliament. And the second was made by the Central London Employment Tribunal in the case of Mr. R. Fraser against the University and College Union at the end of March. In the first case, politician David Ward made use of the Holocaust both to criticise Israel and the Jews by equating Israel with Nazi Germany and by characterising the Holocaust as a moral lesson from which the Jews had failed to learn. When accused of anti-Semitism, mostly by the Jewish community, David Ward's response was that his remarks were not anti-Semitic and that the charge of anti-Semitism was made in bad faith by a powerful lobby in order to stifle legitimate criticism of Israel. In the second case, the Employment Tribunal dismissed a legal claim of hostile environment harassment brought against the lecturers' University and College Union by Jewish member Ronnie Fraser, alleging, inter alia, that the union's repeated discriminatory measures against Israel, its unwillingness to hear complaints of anti-Semitism in response to those measures, and its disavowal of the European Union's working definition of anti-Semitism, on the grounds that it allegedly prevents Israel from being criticised, created a culture of anti-Semitism in the Union which harassed him as a Jew. In its wholesale dismissal of the case, the tribunal made passing reference to Jewish suffering in the Holocaust, but refused to rule on the question of anti-Semitism in the Union. Characterising the Union's repeated discriminatory measures against Israel as, quote, the stuff of political debate, unquote, the tribunal accused the claimant, his 34 witnesses, and his Jewish lawyers of conspiring to bring the case in bad faith in order to prevent the Union from criticising Israel. The use of the Holocaust as a means to criticise Israel, the characterisation of the Holocaust as a moral lesson for Jews rather than a moral wrong done to them, and the denial of anti-Semitism and its associated allegation of bad faith against those who raise it, are now so commonplace in debates involving the Israel-Palestine conflict in the UK that they are considered to be the new tropes of the new or contemporary anti-Semitism. Known respectively as Holocaust Inversion and the Livingstone Formulation, these tropes involve the way in which the Holocaust is remembered and used. Drawing predominantly on the work of British sociologist Robert Fine and British lawyer David Seymour, and using the political judgment of David Ward and the legal judgment of the Employment Tribunal for illustrative purposes, this paper attempts to understand these tropes. I'm going to look first at Holocaust Inversion and secondly at the Livingstone Formulation. So beginning with the Holocaust Inversion and the statement of David Ward, Member of Parliament. David Ward stated, Having visited Auschwitz twice, once with my family and once with local schools, I am saddened that the Jews, who suffered unbelievable levels of persecution during the Holocaust, could, within a few years of liberation from the death camps, be inflicting atrocities on the Palestinians in the new state of Israel and continue to do so on a daily basis in the West Bank and Gaza. Here we see a typical example of Holocaust inversion, which actually involves two distinct but associated tropes, which may or may not appear together. The Israelis as the new Nazis and the Palestinians as the new Jews on the one hand, which is an inversion of reality, and the Holocaust as a moral lesson for, or a moral indictment of, the Jews on the other, which is an inversion of morality. The following sections attempt to shed some light on why they are used and their impact. German political scientist and director of the Berlin International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, Clemens Henny, believes that the equation of Israel, or Jews, or Zionism with Nazism amounts to, quote, an inversion of truth which is used as a form of extremely aggressive anti-Jewish propaganda, unquote. Indeed, lawyer, author, and anti-Semitism activist Anthony Julius notes that the inversion of the Holocaust has become commonplace in the iconography of the new or contemporary anti-Semitism. We see headlines like "The Final Solution to the Palestine Question," references to Holocaust in Gaza, images of IDF soldiers morphing into jackbooted stormtroopers, or of Israeli politicians morphing into Hitler, or of the Star of David morphing into the swastika. The persecuted, the Jews, have become the persecutors of the Palestinians. In terms of the impact on Jews in the UK, Henny's characterization of the Nazification of Israel as extremely aggressive anti-Jewish propaganda rings true. The 2009 report of the European Institute for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, titled Understanding the Nazi Card, Intervening Against Anti-Semitic Discourse, which was funded by the UK's Department of Communities and Local Government, reported that equating Israel with Nazis is the greatest component of incitement and racial aggravation against Jews in the UK today. The report recommended that the Home Office, the Association of Chief Police Officers, and the Crown Prosecution Service prepare guidance for the police on whether the use of Holocaust imagery to refer to contemporary Israeli policy amounts to incitement of racial hatred against Jews. So the question is how to understand the use of the Holocaust, an event which was the defining moment in the development of anti-Semitism, an event so unspeakably horrible that it has been described as a rupture in civilization, a regime that had no other clear principle except murderous hatred of the Jews to precipitate further animosity towards Jews. Or maybe it's not the intention of those who Nazify Israel to cause anti-Jewish resentment. Maybe they really believe that the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to the Jews of Europe. For instance, when pressed, David Ward insisted on the validity of his comparison. He said as follows, and I quote, "Because, don't forget, long before the death camps were set up, the treatment of the Jews in many of these European countries, and of course following 1933, in particular in Nazi Germany, was racist and directed at the Jewish people. It was very low-level, or what is regarded as low-level cases of nastiness and harassment to begin with, and then escalated. And when you look at it, wherever it may be, the West Bank, and a declared intent by the Israeli forces to harass, often just annoy Palestinians, in terms of a checkpoint that will be open on certain days, and then it will be open but at a later time, and the next day it will be open slightly earlier. So you get there and it's been shut again, really just to harass, in many cases to move the Palestinians from land, to just give up and move on. End of quote. Whether or not IDF soldiers deliberately changed the opening and closing times of checkpoints in the West Bank in order to harass Palestinians, I do not know. But even if they do, no matter how wrong that is, there is absolutely no equivalence between that and the ghettos, the labour camps, the starvation, the disease, the denial of paid work, and the Jew baiting that occurred in Germany and Eastern Europe between 1933 and the Holocaust. To claim otherwise invokes the blood libel. Not only is there no real equivalence, there is no moral equivalence either. This brings us to the question of David Ward's possible state of mind when he made the comparison. Did he really believe it was valid? Or was he knowingly making a false comparison, and if so, what could possibly be his reason? Historian Deborah Lipstadt, author of the 1993 book, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory, among other books, and successful defendant in the libel suit brought by Holocaust denier David Irving against her and Penguin Books in 1996, uses the neologism softcore denial to explain Holocaust inversion, as well as other forms of Holocaust distortion. Noting that the false comparison between Israel and the Nazis, quote, elevates by a factor of a zillion any wrongdoings Israel might have done, and lessens by a factor of a zillion what the Germans did, unquote, she considers Holocaust inversion to be, quote, a very convenient way of engaging in anti-Semitism, unquote, because it involves, quote, accusing Jews of atrocities, unquote. In fact, this is exactly what Ward did. Conflating Jews and Israelis, he accused the Jews of inflicting atrocities on the Palestinians. Those were his exact words. Holocaust inversion may well be a convenient way to engage in anti-Semitism, but this does not necessarily help us to understand its specific purpose. Nevertheless, drawing on Anthony Julius's observation that it has become commonplace in the iconography of contemporary anti-Semitism, Holocaust inversion appears to serve a very important political function. For David Ward and his fellow travellers, it is a powerful weapon in the fight to discredit Israel and to deny her legitimacy in order to justify a one secular state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Julius points out that the Zionist Nazi trope not only says to the world that the Zionists are to the Palestinians what Nazis were to the Jews, but also compounds two additional tropes: that the Zionists and Nazis share the same fascist ideology, and that the Zionists are said to have been complicit with the Nazis in the Holocaust. One can therefore understand why, as a practical matter, the playing of the Nazi card is so commonplace in post-1948 anti-Zionist polemic. It also seems to me that the Israel equals Nazi trope resonates with the blood libel. That is, with the medieval anti-Semitic libel that Jews lust for the blood of Gentiles, formerly Christians and now Muslims, and that this makes its use even more of a concern for Jews generally. This is especially so when the proponent of Holocaust inversion conflates Israelis with Jews, as David Ward did. The probability that David Ward was deploying Holocaust inversion for political reasons is buttressed by the fact that the sentiments he expressed have also been expressed by eminent academics in the new anti-Zionist movement. It was the noted anti-Zionist Edward Said who first suggested that Israelis and Jews should be more compassionate and sensitive in their treatment of the Palestinians because of their own history of persecution and suffering, of death camps and the Holocaust. Here we see the idea that the Holocaust was a moral lesson for the Jews rather than a moral wrong done to them. We also see a blurring of Jews and Israelis. Similarly, anti-Zionists Hazem Saghia and Salah Bashir published an article in 1998 titled Universalizing the Holocaust, in which they wrote, quote, "The dissociation between the acknowledgement of the Holocaust and what Israel is doing should be the starting point for the development of a discourse which says that the Holocaust does not free the Jewish state or the Jews of accountability. On the contrary, the Nazi crime compounds their moral responsibility and exposes them to greater answerability. They are the ones who have escaped the ugliest crime in history, and now they are perpetrating reprehensible deeds against another people." End of quote. Again, we see the Holocaust viewed as a moral lesson for Israel and the Jews, which imposes upon them a greater moral responsibility and accountability in their treatment of others. There is even here an implication that Israel and the Jews use the Holocaust to evade responsibility for what Israel does. We also see the equation between the crimes that Nazi Germany perpetrated on the Jews and the Jews rather than the Israelis' treatment of the Palestinians. I still wonder how such claims are possible. What other possible explanations are there for the practice of Holocaust inversion? How can people like David Ward, in all seriousness, judge Israel to be doing to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to the Jews? We saw from his insistence on the validity of the comparison that his judgment is very poor. His statement is wholly inaccurate. Moreover, it trivializes the Holocaust, whitewashes the crimes committed by the Third Reich, inflates the crimes of the Israelis, and blames Jews for not having learnt a moral lesson from the Holocaust. The question of misusing the Holocaust in this way has been addressed and, I believe, answered by David Seymour. He has developed a theoretical explanation for Holocaust inversion in his critique of Zygmunt Bauman's and Jean-François Lyotard's theories on the causes of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. Excuse me. Seymour shows that these theories permit judgments about the Holocaust and Jews to be based solely on ethics. The problem is that there are no checks on the faculty of ethical judgment. Seymour argues that by regarding the Holocaust as the latest stage in modernity and emancipation, respectively, Bauman and Lyotard not only dissolve the specificity of the Holocaust, but they also present it as devoid of all consciousness, all human agency, and all discursive practices of the law. Instead, both account for anti-Semitism and the Holocaust in terms of an ontological ethics, which presents ethics as the other of law. In so doing, they have overlooked the fact that the ethical sphere is not devoid of judgment. Seymour states that, quote, "Ethics is in fact a judgment that can only be described as absolutist and without measure. It is a judgment that is akin to blind fury that, knowing no limits, knows only obstinacy and desperation, and now includes within its repressed memories genocide and death camps." End of quote. Thus, it is Bauman's and Lyotard's removal of law and legalism from judgments relating to the Holocaust in the name of ontological ethics, which, Seymour argues, partly explains the use, or rather abuse, of the Holocaust by inverting it and using it as a standard against which the acts of the Jewish state and the Jews can be measured. Further, Seymour argues that the judgment that the Jews should have learnt their lesson from the Holocaust may be explained, at least in part, by Lyotard's transference of the figure of the Jews as the personification of the ethical onto the sign of Auschwitz, which represents the event of the Holocaust. This makes Auschwitz the embodiment of the ethical in the post-Holocaust world, And as such, Auschwitz now replaces the Jews as, quote, the unidentifiable thorn in the West's flesh, unquote. That is, the sign of Auschwitz is met with unconscious frustration because it is a reminder to Europe both of the limits of emancipation and of a debt that Europe owes to Auschwitz, but which it can never repay. However, as it is not just Auschwitz that acts as that reminder, but also the Jews for whom Auschwitz was brought into being, Seymour says, quote, the potential remains that, once again, Europe will vent that frustration on the personification of its failure. And so it is my contention that it is this resentment against the ethical reading of the Holocaust that partly accounts for the idea that it is the Jews who have betrayed the ethical imperative and, by implication, their own ontological essence that the Holocaust is said to carry within its sign, unquote. Thus, to conclude, it is Seymour's argument that by presenting the Jews and the Holocaust solely in terms of the ethical, Bauman and Leotard have allowed for both past and present judgments about both Jews and the Holocaust to be made solely in terms of the ethical. However, as ethical judgments are made without legal judgment, as ethics is the other of law, they may be both unreflective and absolute. Moreover, ethical judgments bring with them their own unacknowledged and unrestrained violence, and, quote, it is a violence that, like the harm with which it is confronted, is in excess of the measure and dignity of law, and finds expression in the presentation of the Holocaust as a lesson taught to, but not learnt, by the Jews. Although not specifically articulated as an explanation for the temptation to accuse Israel of Nazism in its treatment of the Palestinians, Robert Fine's work on nationalism, post-nationalism and anti-Semitism does, in my view, offer another possible explanation for the practice of Holocaust inversion. Fine discusses the classification of modernity into national and post-national periods, with post-national Europe self-regarded as the civilized continent that has transcended its racist past. Fine points out that this nationalist, post-nationalist dichotomy is problematic because it tends, quote, to endorse a moral division of the world between us and them. We, the civilized and post-nationalist European, they who believe in the purity of the nation and act with corresponding barbarity, unquote. Fine argues that it is this worldview, that in this worldview, Israel can serve to symbolize the other of the idealized post-national Europe. This is because of the temptation to treat post-nationalism not as a critical theory, but as an absolute doctrine. Israel can serve this doctrine well, not as a real country embroiled in real conflicts, but as a symbolic vessel into which post-national Europe can project all that is bad in its own past. In this way, Israel becomes the incarnation of all the negative properties post-national Europe has allegedly thrown off: racism, colonialism, ethnic cleansing, violence, and even genocide. By projecting onto Israel all that is bad in old Europe's past, it becomes possible and indeed acceptable for David Ward and those who subscribe to a similar worldview to characterize Israelis or Zionists as Nazis. Now I'm going to go on to look at the Livingstone Formulation, which is the denial of anti-Semitism and the corresponding or associated accusation of bad faith against those who raise it. And so again, we'll return to the statement of David Ward and then move on to look at the Central London Employment Tribunal's decision. Okay, so in response to continued criticism of his statement on the ground that it was anti-Semitic, David Ward denied anti-Semitism and said, quote, "There is a huge operation out there, a machine almost, which is designed to protect the State of Israel from criticism. And that comes into play very, very quickly and focuses intensely on anyone who's seen to criticize the state of Israel. And so I end up looking at what happened to me, whether I should use this word, whether I should use that word, and that is winning for them. End of quote. This is an example of the Livingstone Formulation, the term coined by David Hirsch to refer to the practice of responding to claims of contemporary anti-Semitism by alleging that those making the claim are doing so dishonestly to prevent Israel from being criticized, that their anti-Semitism is not anti-Semitism at all, but only criticism of Israel. In other words, those raising concerns about the existence of contemporary anti-Semitism are merely playing the anti-Semitism card. The Livingstone Formulation is itself anti-Semitic because it sees a secret agenda behind the charge of anti-Semitism, which is to silence Israel's critics. As Fine notes, quote, one dodgy presumption behind this argument is that Israel cannot be defended openly, so its defenders have to resort to underhand tactics, end of quote. Ward's statement is a powerful illustration of the Livingstone Formulation. His comment seems to imply that there is a powerful Zionist lobby lurking in the background whose sole purpose is to silence critics of Israel by accusing them of anti-Semitism. While Ward strongly suggests that an ad hominem attack is being made on him by that huge operation out there, a machine almost, it is in fact he who is making an ad hominem attack on those who question contemporary anti-Semitism. Rather than the huge operation deflecting criticism of Israel, Ward is deflecting legitimate concerns about anti-Semitism. He is moving the debate from legitimate questions about anti-Semitism to accusations of being dishonest in order to protect Israel from criticism. This is a major problem because, as Fine notes, it prevents the identification of changing forms of anti-Semitism and the marshalling of active resistance to it. Now I'll look at the Livingstone Formulation in relation to the case of Fraser against the University and College Union. The Livingstone Formulation was recently deployed by a court of law. In Mr. R. Fraser against and the University and College Union, the judgment was handed down on March the 22nd this year. The Central London Employment Tribunal dismissed a claim against the University and College Union alleging institutional anti-Semitism in the union, which harassed the Jewish claimant by causing him to be subjected to a hostile environment. There were 10 distinct grounds outlined in the complaint, which, the claimant alleged, constituted anti-Semitic conduct on the part of the union. One of those grounds was the union's obsessive and unlawful pursuit of a boycott policy against Israeli academics and no others in the world. In its wholesale dismissal of the case on all 10 grounds, the Employment Tribunal decided that it was not required or prepared to rule on the meaning or definition of anti-Semitism, including the EUMC, that is the European Union Monitoring Centre on Racism and Xenophobia, the EUMC working definition of anti-Semitism, put forward by the claimant and disavowed by the union. Noting that some members of the union did not like the EUMC definition of anti-Semitism on the grounds, this is what they claimed, that it brands attacks on Zionism as anti-Semitic and precludes criticism of Israel, while others, such as the claimant himself, did like it, the tribunal concluded that there were legitimately held differences of view on what constitutes anti-Semitism and where the line should be drawn in relation to when criticism of Israel becomes anti-Semitic, and that, moreover, this is the, quote, stuff of political debate, unquote. The tribunal's refusal to even consider the possibility of anti-Semitism in the Union constitutes a denial of anti-Semitism. Denis McShane, Britain's former Minister for Europe, chair of the 2008 all-party parliamentary committee of inquiry into anti-Semitism, was a witness for the claimant in the case. On the April the 30th, he told Haaretz newspaper that, quote, "I was a witness at the tribunal, and it was clear that I was facing three middle-class English people who just refused to accept that anti-Semitism is a contemporary problem. I looked at their implacable, indifferent, bored faces and knew that the case was lost," unquote. Further, the tribunal's denial of anti-Semitism was accompanied by the Livingstone Formulation. The tribunal chose to view the claimant's allegation of anti-Semitism, which had been supported by no less than 34 witnesses, as an attempt to silence free political debate in the Union, noting that the claimant was the child of refugees from the Holocaust and that, quote, "so long and terrible has been the persecution of the Jewish people through history," unquote, the tribunal stated, quote, "We greatly regret that the case was ever brought. At heart, it represents an impermissible attempt to achieve a political end by litigious means. It would be very unfortunate if an exercise of this sort were ever repeated." As this paper is concerned with the misuses of the Holocaust in political and legal judgment in the UK, one might wonder why the denial of contemporary anti-Semitism and its associated allegation of bad faith are relevant. At first blush, it would appear there is no connection. But as Seymour and Fine have argued, there is a connection between the way the Holocaust is remembered and the denial of contemporary anti-Semitism. Let's consider Seymour's argument first. In his 2007 book, Law, Anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, he critiques the explanation of Nietzsche, Sartre, Lyotard and Agamben for the causes of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. He critiques their explanations. He shows that despite their differences, they all lead to a universalist perspective on the Holocaust in which all Jewish specificity is lost. Seymour refers to this as Holocaust disillusion, which results in the commodification of Holocaust memory. Then in his conference paper delivered at Harvard Law School in March this year, titled Critical Theory, the Holocaust, Human Rights and Anti-Semitism, Seymour argues the explanations of Zygmunt Bauman, Michel Foucault and Giorgio Agamben for anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, he critiques those and demonstrates that despite some differences, a unifying theme in their work is the equation of the Holocaust with the nation-state and modernity. Drawing on both his 2007 book and his 2013 conference paper, Seymour argues that the theoretical development in which the Holocaust comes to be dissolved within the broad concept of modernity and the abstract universalism of human rights gives rise to two distinct consequences. These are that genocidal anti-Semitism is strictly equated with modernity, which has now been transcended, and the theoretical inability to recognize anti-Semitism in its non-genocidal form, both in the old Europe and in the new. Seymour believes that this accounts for the denial of contemporary anti-Semitism, as well as the intensity of that denial and the accusations of bad faith and Jewish particularism that frequently accompanies it. Fine agrees with Seymour's view, but bases his analysis on the nationalism-post-nationalism dichotomy. Fine argues that Jürgen Habermas's conception of post-nationalism represents the new post-national Europe as the civilized continent in which anti-Semitism is a thing of the past, overcome by the defeat of fascism and the development of the European Union. This consignment of anti-Semitism to the old Europe prevents the new Europe from maintaining an ongoing critical engagement with it, as advocated by Habermas. It is for this reason that whenever concerns are expressed about contemporary anti-Semitism, it is denied and translated into an attempt to stifle legitimate criticism of Israel, along with the frequent accusation that those claiming anti-Semitism are reverting back to a national and un-European exclusivity. To conclude, in this paper, I have used a recent political judgment and a recent legal judgment in an attempt to illustrate and explain the correspondence between the Holocaust and contemporary anti-Semitism in the UK, by which I mean manifestations of irrational forms of hostility to Israel, Zionism, Zionists in discourses around the Israel-Palestine conflict. On the one hand, the Holocaust serves as a means to express such irrational hostility, precipitating further resentment towards and even hatred of UK Jews. On the other hand, the Holocaust, being associated as it is with a genocidal anti-Semitism that has long been consigned to history, serves to prevent such manifestations of irrational hostility to Israel, Zionism, Zionists, and the anti-Jewish animus they foster from being acknowledged and resisted. It's as if the use of the Holocaust to perpetuate anti-Semitism is juxtaposed against the naive assumption that all anti-Semitism was dissolved in the fires of Auschwitz. I believe that there is a pressing need for changes in the way we think about anti-Semitism in the UK. There needs to be a recognition that anti-Semitism may take many forms, that it is protean, and that it is not always easy to distinguish hatred of Israel from hatred of Jews. As Fine notes, quote, "Anti-Semitism may or may not be openly expressed. It may linger in the discursive nooks and crannies of well-honed anti-Semitic motifs, conspiracy, secret power, bloodlust, etc. As is the case in the presentation of self in everyday life, the forms of appearance of the new anti-Semitism may not immediately reveal what lies behind the scenes. It is precisely because it takes the work of judgment and understanding to identify contemporary anti-Semitism that those who raise concerns about it need to be taken seriously. It is simply not good enough for a member of Parliament and a court of law to insult those people with an accusation of acting in bad faith. Yes.